You see this picture? Well, okay, now do you see this picture? So this, no, but too close. Okay, you see this picture? It's fine, but it's kind of boring. We're gonna make it colorful. Isn't that better? So once you open up your PNG or your PXZ in Pixlr, you're gonna find you've got a couple layers that you're working with. I went ahead and made a white layer in the background so I could see what I was doing better. And then I started using my brush and picking some colors. Just color it in like you would when you were a kindergartner with the crayons. Only this time you're using your mouse or your trackpad. At this point, I started to think the hair was getting kind of boring, so I made a little bit of a darker brown to make it more interesting. This guy has a lot of hair. And then I started also messing around with the skin. And it's at this point that I realized I could probably use the fill command and save myself a little bit of time. Although it's not perfect, and sometimes you gotta like fix it because it messed things up. And sometimes I get bored and I'll leave the hair, go back to the skin, go back to the hair again. It's okay. Nobody's watching how you do this. You just gotta get it done. So now I want to pick a good earth tone for the pants. Color that in, fill it in, not so bad. Put in some legs. I figured this leg is underneath everything, so I made it a little bit of a darker color than the skin. Now I'm getting bored again, and I'm hoping I can use my fill to fill in the sky, but the problem is that the illustration has a lot of gaps in it. So when I try to select something, it fills in everything. So I got to do this the old-fashioned way and trace it around like I'm using crayons again. And the blue I went with is kind of a mid-shade blue. I try to avoid picking just the bluest blue because that gets boring and it gives you nowhere to go. Then I started doing my lava. Notice that I'm coloring way outside the lines, and what I figured out I could do is use the magic wand tool later to delete the parts I don't want. Sometimes I remember that, sometimes I forget. But in that case, that's what I'm doing. I'm just selecting and then deleting the parts that are outside the line. There's not really much to say about this part. It's kind of obvious, except for I did forget about the deleting trick, and now I'm having to be careful. I didn't want to make the whole background just one color, so I'm trying to play around with a few shades of this kind of putty grayish color, just to create a little bit more interest. But that's one of the problems with the original picture, is it's really busy, so I'm also trying to simplify it. But I've got to work with what's there. And I decided that's off in the distance, so I went with an even lighter color. And I figured maybe it's far enough away that it's cold, and a lighter color might make it feel like it's a bit colder out there. Now it came with the fish. I figured that's such a big centerpiece, and fish are kind of interesting. I decided to experiment with this one and see if I could put in a little bit of a gradient, just so it had a little bit more dimension, felt a little bit less flat, since it is this round torpedo shape looking object. And I painted in a few details over it to keep it from feeling too monotonous. But I'll come back to it later. Now, the polar bear, I decided to color blue because this is kind of a surreal picture anyway, and I didn't want to just leave him boring old white. And I figured the blue might do a better job of reflecting the sky. Then I decided to add a little bit of a darker, a little bit more yellowish, greenish, shaded color, just to give it a little bit more depth and dimension, and to kind of remind us that this is just sort of a gritty, messy picture as well. Now I'm working out some more details in the foreground, and want to make that stand out a little bit more, so the colors are getting a little bit darker. Experimenting a little bit here, decided to switch up the colors just a little bit to add a little bit more interest and some dimension. Then I got a little bored and decided to just lasso large areas and fill those in, and then try to work out some a little bit more differentiation later. Yeah, sometimes using the lasso tool to trace an area first and then fill it is worth taking that extra time. It can save a step here and there, especially for large areas. And here, unfortunately, the pixlr doesn't remember the last gradient you used. It just has its stock template ones, or it bases your template on your colors that are chosen. So I had to keep reselecting green and purple and hope I remembered how to do it right. And just to add a little bit more interest to the fish, I just thought some purple thrown in there would make them look a little bit more lifelike. Then I used the lasso tool and had the teeth match the eye. And begin working on some of those little details. At this point, I realized that was the polar bear's hand. I didn't realize that until the very end. Now I'm just doing a little cleaning up here and there. And I'm filling in these areas with the darker brown, and that just adds a little bit more dimension to the mountain. I should have done that, repeated it on the right side, but I didn't. Because sometimes you just got to be done. But I am doing some touch-ups here with some of the more obvious mistakes. And it's around this point that I think I start feeling like the background, the midground, and the foreground all look a little bit too similar. So I'm trying to bring out the foreground a little bit more, but it is kind of tedious. And I decided that maybe I can lasso the midground and adjust the tone and saturation just to kind of change things up a little bit and break the picture up. And I end up deciding to go for something a little bit green, so it has a little bit more of a lively, earthy feel to it. And that's how we go from a black and white to a color image. Happy coloring.